As a kid, um, I was fortunate to grow up with one set of my grandparents just down the road from us. But my mom's parents lived about 2 hours away from my hometown in a small town called Emerson, Nebraska, not too far from Sioux City, Iowa. In this town of Emerson, actually, technically it's a village, it's not quite a town. This village of Emerson, Nebraska, was the place where my grandpa Bill pastored for decades. And as we would go up to visit them from time to time, maybe a couple times a year, these visits would be filled with cookies and hugs and catching up on village news. Because while this town was small, which typically means that everybody's pretty well connected, on top of that, my grandpa was well connected as a pastor, and my grandma Enid, had just the gift of gab. And she loved to stay up to date on everything that was going on pretty much within like a 20-mile radius. She always had a lot to report. And I think I've become convinced of this, that this is a trait of pastors' wives from that generation. And I can say that because my wife's grandmother was also a pastor's wife, and she has this incredible ability to retain all kinds of information about people and then just wants to share that with whoever will listen. And so she's always in the loop. They were both always in the loop. And so I've come to this conclusion that this is just a feature of pastors' wives of that generation. And so with that, each visit, we'd hear these elaborate stories about things that were going on in the town and people that I had no idea who they were. Just story after story. And you're there trying to keep track of what's going on here. You don't know these people. You've never met them. You probably will never meet them. Your life may probably never intersect with those. And so you're kind of left there wondering, why are we talking about this? Very politely, right? You sit there and you listen and you try to generate some kind of interest in the story, and you're wondering, why are we spending this time talking about these folks? And that's kind of what the first half of this passage feels like to me. Like all these names, all these places, you've got this drama that's going on. It's so far removed from us. You're wondering, how does this fit within the storyline of Genesis that so far has been really, really focused on Abram and his family? And you're kind of read this, specifically the first half, and you're like, who cares? What is this about? But one of the things that we need to realize is that the first half of Genesis 14 sets the stage for the epic and mysterious events that happen in the second half of Genesis 14. They're epic because we see a new side of Abram. He is an older gentleman, but here we see Abram as a warrior hero. He's tough. And he goes out and he does this incredible feat of delivering his nephew Lot from being captive to a bunch of wicked kings. And so we see the story about Abram and his 318 men. Unlikely victory, which before Sparta's 300, you have Abram's 318, which is pretty interesting. Then, the mystery part of the story is that we have this guy named Melchizedek who kind of emerges out of nowhere, who we're told is a priest of the Most High God, and he comes out and he blesses Abram, and he kind of just disappears. As quickly as he shows up, he just disappears, and we don't really hear from him in the story of Genesis any further from this. But Melchizedek is actually a significant figure. For as mysterious as he is, he's a significant figure. In Psalm 110 today, which was our responsive reading, Melchizedek is mentioned by the King David as he speaks about this new king, the seed of David who would take the throne after him from his offspring, who will be of the order of Melchizedek. So there's this reference, and Psalm 110, if you didn't know, is the most quoted Old Testament passage in the New Testament. It's quoted 27 or so times. It's referenced a lot, and every time it gets referenced, it's sort of in the back of your mind. It's supposed to anytime a section of a psalm is referenced, the whole of the psalm is sort of being invoked. And so we have the psalm that's heavily used throughout the New Testament, and then on top of that, the author of the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 5, 6, and 7, 3 chapters, his conversation, his dialogue revolves around this guy, this mystery man, Melchizedek. And this mystery man, one of the reasons why he's so significant is that he plays a critical role in helping us understand the identity and the office that Jesus occupies. And as we look at this passage, actually we learn a lot about Jesus. This passage doesn't mention Jesus by name at all. In fact, none of the passages in Genesis will mention the name Jesus. But as we look at this passage, what we're going to see between Abram, the warrior hero, Melchizedek, who's both a king and a priest, what we're going to see is Jesus fulfilling all of these offices. And in turn, it will help us worship Jesus more. So let's set the stage here. Let's look at the beginning of this. I'll summarize this very quickly. I'm not going to mess around with the names. I'll give you the 30,000-foot view of what's going on here as we look at what could be called World War I. This conflict is the first conflict, the geopolitical conflict, tribal conflict that the Bible captures for us. And it's the first of many. We just got done reading the book of Joshua. We've been reading through Judges in our Bible reading plan. And so you see a lot of this conflict continue to go along. And many of these names will sound familiar to you as we read these. But this is the first geopolitical conflict in the Bible. And what brings this on is that after a 12-year coalition between 9 different kingdoms under the rule of Chedorlaomer, which is a really hard name to say, it dissolves. This 12-year coalition dissolves because in the 13th year, there is a rebellion where 5 smaller tribes, 5 smaller kingdoms decide, we're done with this, we're out, we're going to go do our own thing. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to why they did this, but one of the things was just the greed, the conquest that you see when a king gets power and it starts to swell and swell and swell and swell, and they lose their ability to self-represent. And so what happens as a fallout of this is these 5 smaller kingdoms split apart from the 4 larger, more powerful kingdoms, which still remains under the rule of Chedorlaomer. And instead of living in peace with one another as the offspring of Noah, which everybody on the world at this point, in fact, everybody now can even say this, that we are offspring of Noah. We are descendants of Noah. Instead of living as cousins and brothers, what they do is they wake up and they choose violence. They choose to go to war. And these 4 bigger kingdoms begin to expand their kingdom. They experience the void of these 5 smaller kingdoms, and they go out and defeat 6 other surrounding tribes, and among them are the Rephaim, which are giants. They go on this conquest to expand their kingdom. Now, as this kingdom is expanding, those 5 rebel kingdoms, those smaller kingdoms, are scared that they are going to get gobbled up next. And so rather than just rolling over and playing dead, they decide, we're going to go out, we're going to resist this, we're going to engage in the conflict to defend. And it's not very long after they start the battle that they get their booties whooped. They get crushed. They're dominated. Some people, we're told, get killed on the battlefield. Others get captured while others flee. And a number of those people fall into these bitumen pits, which is just a pit of goo, essentially. It's like quicksand, but stickier, maybe. I don't know. But they fall into this, and with that, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah get plundered. This is typical happening whenever there's political or a kingdom expansion. To the victors goes the spoils. And so they get to take all the goods, all the people, and typically they leave the city in ruins. Not all the time, but often. So these bigger, more powerful kingdoms walk away with the booty. They walk away with the treasure of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the reason why this is included, because these all seem to be people who don't really fit in with the story or the family of Abraham. The reason why this story is included in Genesis is because Abram's nephew Lot happens to be living in Sodom at this time, and he is among those who get pulled away in captivity. All of his riches, all of his wealth, all of his people get taken away, and they're being exiled from the land of Sodom. Now, one of the things that we need to remember, back in Genesis 13, we saw this episode where Abram and Lot, they had Their people, their tribes had gotten so big that the land could not support both of them at the same time. And so Abram gave Lot the choice. You can go this way, you can go to the place, and it looks a lot like the lush lands of Egypt, or even, as Lot said, it looked like the Garden of Eden. You could go there, or you can have the promised land, the land of Canaan. And Lot chose with his eyes. He decided to go towards this lush land, which is near Sodom. So he sets up camp near Sodom. But by Genesis chapter 14, what we see is he is no longer near Sodom, he is in Sodom. He's been sucked in. Now, this is significant because we were previously told that Sodom, and we'll see this later on as well, is a city of great wickedness. Just absolutely wretched sinners that live in a way that is in total defiance against God. And this city of wickedness has effectively sucked Lot into their gravitational force field of sin. Now, there's a lesson in this for us here as we pass by this. Sin is never satisfied. Sodom was not satisfied with Lot living on the outside. It wanted to pull him in. And in the same way, that's how sin works in our lives. These little itty-bitty sins. Maybe, this sin's not that big of a deal. It's like a little lion cub, right? It's cute. I can manage a little lion cub. But sin always grows because the aim of sin is to devour. That little lion cub, that little sin that you treated as not a big deal, will grow up into a roaring beast and will consume you, as we see here with Lot. He's being consumed. Thus, as Christians, we are instructed by the Apostle Paul that if we're not fighting sin actively, what we need to be doing is fleeing from sin, as he says in 2 Timothy 2, verse 22. Flee from sin. Flee from your youthful lusts and desires, because these things will capture you. They will take you captive, and they will destroy you. Now, Lot here has a brush with destruction. He gets taken captive by these kings, and he's hauled away. Because he did not flee from sin, he got sucked into it. Now he, his people, his wealth are being hauled away as plunder. And in the midst of this chaos, there's one messenger who escapes from the grips of captivity and runs to tell Lot's uncle Abram that something's wrong, that Lot is in trouble. And so this messenger goes and he finds Abram right where he left him. See, while sin drew Lot deeper and deeper into the city of Sodom, Abram is still posted up by the oaks of Mamre, content, dwelling in the land that God had promised that it would be his, and he's being content there. And in the midst of that, he's been able to develop some sort of allegiances, some allies amongst the land at the time. So Abram, in contentment, remains where he was planted, and now he rises up to do something about Lot's predicament. There's something about Abram in the situation that's worth noting, something praiseworthy in Abram. Abram could have looked at Lot's predicament and said, good luck, praying for you. He could have looked at Lot and said, hey, you made your bed. No, you need to lie in it. This is a temptation that we face when we see someone else's folly catch up with them. See, Lot's folly was pulling him in a way. And I think the book of Galatians talk about that. If anyone is caught in sin, if anybody is ensnared in sin, that you who are mature and spiritual should restore him with the spirit of gentleness. But our tendency is to look at somebody else's folly and say, serves you right. Should have listened to me earlier. But Abram doesn't do that. Abram, remembering his departing words to his nephew Lot, he said to him, we are kinsmen. He says, we're brothers. We don't need to fight. We don't need a war against each other. There's no bad blood here. You are mine. Like, I look at you and I see somebody I love, I care for. Abram, full of integrity, lives consistent to his word. Abram follows through, right? It's not just lip service like, hey, we're tight. He rises to the occasion. He assembles 318 trained men. Now, these guys are warriors. These aren't no chumps, right? These guys in that part of the world, there's all kinds of threats, there's all kinds of dangers, there's all kinds of opportunity for people to come up and threaten your livelihood. And so one of the things that they needed to do was be ready, to be on guard. And so Abram has these warriors who are ready, who are trained, who are willing to go into battle. Some of these coming from some of the neighboring tribes. He calls them up and says, hey, we got to go take care of my nephew Lot. And what drives them is not hatred for the enemy, but rather love for his kinsman, love for his brother Lot. This is what I love. G.K. Chesterton has this absolutely incredible quote. He says that the true soldier doesn't fight because he hates what's in front of him. He fights because he loves what's behind him. Abram loves Lot. He's not going out there just to pick a fight for the sake of picking a fight. He's going out there to rescue his own kinsman. And so they come up with a plan to divide and conquer in verse 16. With this small, agile army of trained men, they're going to divide up into different groups. They're going to, in the dead of night, go into this place and try to free all the people, all the things, take all the things that have been taken as plunder, and God grants them success. And in this, Abram is presented in his old age as a true warrior hero. When we think of Abram, we shouldn't think of a feeble old man, but an older, established, more refined gentleman who also has the ability to rise up and to defend and to bring back what is his. He is a force to be reckoned with. In this way, Abram is a redeemer. Abram, the true warrior hero, is a redeemer who brings back his nephew Lot and his possessions, and on top of that, all of the other things that have been taken away from Sodom and Gomorrah. That which was in the clutches of evil, it was in the clutches of sin, right? This wicked kingdom that came up and started to try to take over world domination style. It was swept up, it was in the grips of sin, and Abram sticks out his own neck for his kin. And he brings him back. God grants him success. Now, this points us to Jesus. Abram the Redeemer points us to Jesus the Redeemer, who delivers us from sin and death at his own expense. Jesus stuck his neck out for us. When we were in the clutches of sin and death, when we were yet sinners, Christ died for us to free us from the grip of the evil one. And just as Jesus humbled himself, God exalted him. Philippians 2 tells us that because Jesus humbled himself, God exalted him and gave him the name above every other name. To the victor goes the spoils. Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, and part of the spoils was Jesus receiving his bride, the church. Abram's spoils from this victory is his nephew. His nephew's possessions, and a bunch of other stuff that had been hauled off. To the victor goes the spoils. And as Abram returns victorious and his hands loaded with things that he's bringing back, he is greeted by two kings who are very, very different. Two very different kinds of kings. On the one hand, you have the king of Sodom, who again, according to Genesis 13:13, is a very wicked city, run by a very wicked man. So you have the king of Sodom, who's marked by wickedness, and you have the king of Salem, who goes by the name of Melchizedek, who we're told in Hebrews 7, his name, like we're given the meaning of his name. His name means righteousness, the king of righteousness. So here you have the king of wickedness, the king of wickedness. And with that, it's either Christ or chaos. So wickedness is going to lead to a chaotic state, discord, disarray, chaos. And the city that Melchizedek rules over is called Salem, which means peace. Hebrews 7 lays this all out for us in verse 2. We have the king of righteousness, the king of peace. Now, interestingly, this place called Salem is sort of a precursor for what we will know as Jerusalem later on. Sodom, the king of Sodom, comes to Abram empty-handed. It just says he came out to him. And as he comes out, we'll see later on in the passage that the king of Sodom comes out to strike a bargain with Abram. So he comes out empty-handed, and then he's actually looking to get something out of Abram. On the other hand, you have Melchizedek, who comes out not empty-handed, but in his hands are bread and wine. We see this. Verse 17, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. And not only does he bring out bread and wine, but Melchizedek comes with lips loaded to bless Abram. We see this blessing in verse 19. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High." So here you have this instance where Melchizedek is being a mouthpiece. He's pronouncing this over, but he's also testifying to the fact that God has blessed him. He said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." That is God, the possessor of heaven and earth. "And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." Now, this whole thing is shrouded in mystery here, because we're wondering, where did this guy come from? Right, so far, if we're just basing our understanding off of what we read through the book of Genesis so far, it seems like Abram is the only one and his family are the only one in the world who knows who God is. And yet we have this man, Melchizedek, the king, and we're told he's a priest, who comes from the city of Salem, who is worshiping the same God. There is no recorded backstory of Melchizedek. We're not given his origin. We're not told of his death. In fact, in Hebrews 7, verse 3, it says this about him. He is without father or mother or genealogy. Speaking of the scriptures not giving any genealogy. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. So not only does he come out of nowhere, it's like the Bible doesn't provide any genealogy. It doesn't tell us the beginning of his days. It doesn't tell us the end of his days. He is certainly intended to be this sort of mysterious figure because he's a foreshadowing of Christ. Now, as he interacts with as Abram interacts with Melchizedek, he realizes, again, they're on the same team. They're both worshiping the same God. Right? The God the Most High, or the Most High God, is a reference specifically among Gentile nations. So here you have a region of the world that is just littered with polygamy. Different worship of different kinds of gods. You know, this tribe has their God, that tribe has this God. But the way the Hebrews, the Israelites, spoke of their God was the God of gods. Not giving any credit or legitimizing these gods, because what we're told later by the Apostle Paul is that they're all idols, they're all demons anyway. But he is the true God. And here, Abram and Melchizedek find that they are serving the same God. But not only are they serving the same God, we're told that Melchizedek is a priest of the Most High God. Here you have this unique blend of he is a king of Salem. He's also a priest of the Most High God. And one of the things that this is communicating to us is that Melchizedek is of a special order. In the Old Testament, there are clear lineages to each of these offices. To break it down, you have the office of king, priest, and prophet. Now, the kingly lineage is by blood. It's like, my daddy was a king, so if I'm the firstborn, I'll be a king. The same thing goes with the priests. You have the Levites, who are after the order of Aaron. They established this in the wilderness. Aaron is appointed as the priest. And then the Levites from there are, because they're all part of the same blood, they're the ones that will follow suit. And then occupy the office of priest later on. Prophets sort of came up and went. God just chose those people as he so desired. But here we see this blending, which doesn't happen in the Old Testament. We don't see a blend of king and priest. These are distinct offices served by distinct families. But here, Melchizedek is presented as both king and priest. And this is because he was called by oath by God. He was appointed not because of blood lineage, but God called him specifically to serve in this office. Again, Hebrews 7 is a helpful passage to gain some understanding of what's going on here. In verse 21, it says this, "But this one," speaking of Melchizedek, "was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him," so by God, who said, "The Lord has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." This means that when Abram is blessed by Melchizedek, these are not just words of any rando. This is like a bona fide. This is somebody whose blessing carries special weight. As a priest of God, as the king of Salem, king of peace, his words carry weight. Now, the blessing of Melchizedek itself is fascinating. You see how, it's like if you break it up into quarters by line, you see him bless Abram, but ultimately the blessing is pointed at God. Like ultimately the one that Melchizedek is praising and blessing is not Abram, but God, the Most High, who has given him victory. Melchizedek sees this. He sees God behind the activity of Abram. And as he blesses Abram, he's confirming something that God has already put in place. If you remember the covenant that God made with Abraham back in Genesis 12, that God was going to bless him. And through him, the rest of the world would be blessed. He said, "I'm going to bless you to be a blessing." Well, here we see Abram, this blessing of God confirmed, that you have a priest of the Most High God come out and say what God has already said about Abram. And he is giving all of the credit, all of the glory, all of the accolades, all the praise back to God. He says, "It is God Most High who has delivered you, or has delivered your enemies into your hand." See, this has more to do with God's victory, with God's sovereignty, than it does with Abram's activity. God was behind it. God was orchestrating it. And when this blessing lands on Abram, what happens? How does he respond? Well, we see this right away. "And Abram gave him a tenth of everything." He gives him a tithe of everything that he has. This priest who came out of nowhere, the king of Salem, Abram responds to this blessing and he gives him a tenth. Now, this is interesting here because we've seen the same thing play out with the Sabbath day. We saw in the very first chapters of Genesis how God created. He worked 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. Now, was there a command at this point for God's people to rest on the seventh day? No, but because that's a creational design, there's this expectation. We're going to do what God does. God worked 6 days, therefore on the seventh day we're going to rest until we come to Mount Sinai and we're given the Ten Commandments, where God then puts the Sabbath day, he codifies it into a law. He makes it a command. Now, the same thing happens with the tithe. Because we've seen sacrifice offered before now, we've seen these offerings that are being made by the righteous people in God's story, we can assume that there's this natural response that when God blesses us, what a righteous response to God's blessing is that we give back to God. We say, "Thank you, God," and one of the ways that we say thank you is we give back to him. And so you see this idea of a tenth, which we'll see here with Abram. We'll see later on, I think, is it with Jacob or Isaac? We'll see it again. But then in Leviticus 27, then the idea of a tithe is commanded. But right here, what we see is this natural response. The natural response of somebody who's been blessed by God is to turn around and be a blessing. And as Abram offers Melchizedek a tenth of everything he has, what this is doing is indicating the superiority of Melchizedek, this king priest. Now, this might be hard to kind of wrap our minds around because we think, okay, at this time, Abram, as the one who possesses the promises, right? He's the one that God gave the promise. He's got to be the top dog, right? He's got to be, if there's a hierarchy, there's a totem pole of most important peoples, he's up there at the top. But actually in Hebrews 7, again, it tells us something different. It says this starting in verse 4, see how great this man was, Melchizedek, this man was whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a tenth of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people. So there's the commandment from Leviticus 27. That is, from their brothers. Though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man who does not have his descendant from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior, that is Abraham, is blessed by the superior, that is Melchizedek. Here Melchizedek comes out, and he's the superior of the two because he's the one who's blessing, but then he's also the one who receives the tithes. Now it's interesting here because later on in that passage it goes on to say that even being in the loins of Abram, the Levites, who would be the ones collecting the tithes, are actually in this moment in sort of like a, God, the Lord of time sort of scenario, they are in the loins giving their offerings to Melchizedek. It's one of these things that hard to wrap your mind around. But we see this gesture, we see this response of gratitude from Abram as he receives a blessing. And as soon as this interaction with the king of Salem kind of halts or, sort of wind down, the story switches. We go from the king of Salem to the king of Sodom, who comes out empty-handed, and he comes to strike a deal with Abram. He basically makes this proposition. At this point, Abram has all the power. Abram is the deliverer. To the victor goes the spoils. He rightfully, like all that stuff in the world of law and theory, war theory, those belong to Abram. But the king of Sodom comes out and says, hey, you give me the people and you can keep the loot. He's trying to strike a deal with Abram so he gets back people, because if he loses his people, he loses his kingdom. So he's trying to maintain his own kingdom. And at the same time, he makes this sort of offer, hey, you can keep the riches. Now, this may seem nice, like a nice gesture from the king of Sodom, but actually it's a proposition that is loaded. This deal would imply that there's some kind of allegiance now being formed with Abram, the blessed, the called, and Sodom, the city of wickedness. The king of Sodom is trying to make friends with money. And the way that Abraham sees this it would be a moral and spiritual compromise. For him to take this deal, for him to create this allegiance with a city of wickedness, which we're to have no part in evil, have no part in wickedness, Abram sees this to be a moral and spiritual failure. And he says so in verse 22 after this proposition is made. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. You can see him now, he's reusing that language that Melchizedek had used. That I would not take a thread or sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich. So in this moment, Abram's saying, listen, I want to take any opportunity that you have, king of Sodom, to take any credit for my well-being, to take any credit for me becoming this blessed and prosperous man. He's like, I'm going to say no, just straight up no. In fact, I don't want anything from you but the food that we ate on the journey, and then whatever my allies who came with me, they can have their share. But I want nothing. I want nothing from you. To take this deal would make Abram a partnership with wickedness. He wants to make sure that his state of blessing can only be attributed to God, just as his victory against these other kingdoms was only attributed to God and not man. He wants to take away any opportunity that he has for boasting, which I think there's a lesson in this here. If Abram were to, just say, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. I deserve this. I fought. What happened there? Pride would start to set in. And then before you know it, this is a scenario that I'm playing out, he'd be going to these other areas and say, hey, I defeated these guys, piece of cake. What's to say that I couldn't move over to this next tribe in the promised land and take them by my own force? He's cutting off the temptation at its root. He wants to make sure that all praise and honor and glory and accolade goes only to God, not to himself, nor to any other man. The king of Sodom comes out trying to strike a bargain. Trying to get Abram just to fold in with what he's doing and try to make it seem like it's advantageous for both of them. Now, in this, when I read this, one of the things that it reminds me of is actually the temptation of Jesus when he's out in the wilderness after his baptism. Satan comes to Jesus, and one of the temptations that we see is he says, hey, I'll give you all the kingdoms. I'll give you everything you want, Jesus, if you just bow down. If you say, okay, we're linking up together. It's Jesus and Satan, and together we're going to take over the world. But Jesus refuses. I see the similarities between these two stories because here, Abram, though he's been blessed and though he knows that more blessing is coming his way, he insists on this blessing coming only through God's providence. In the same way, Jesus knows that he's come into the world. He's come into the world to live and die, to live according to God's will, so that at the end that there would be a payout that only God can give. So just as Satan is trying to propose to Jesus, hey, take the easy road. You can get the kingdoms, you can get the people, you can have the glory without the cross. Jesus says, no, I'm going to do God's will, God's way. And in that, there is God's blessing. In the same way, Abram does the same thing. I'm going to do God's will, God's way, and in that, I know there is blessing that no man can take credit for. The cup that God had given Jesus was the cup of suffering. And it's through the suffering that Jesus ransoms us, that he saves us. It wasn't just Jesus running in with a sword and, fighting off the bad guys and kind of driving them away. No, Jesus won by going through the grave. And in that, he ransoms us. He delivers us from the domain of darkness and transfers us to the kingdom of his beloved Son. This was God's will. There had to be a cross. There was the blood of bulls and goats were not enough to satisfy the righteousness, the justice of God. There had to be a sinless substitute in our place. And without the blood of Christ, there is no forgiveness for our sins, for the times that we have, like Lot, have been sucked into sin. But through Christ's suffering, not only is there deliverance, but we find true blessing. In him, we have been blessed with every spiritual blessing. Christ is blessed forever, and we, because we are in union with him, are also blessed forever because of what he has done on our behalf. And there are so many, we could do a whole entire sermon series just thinking about the blessings that come to us through Christ's work. But here, let me just, in the spirit of what we see in this text, let me wrap up by showing you three of the most important blessings that we have in Christ. Number one is that we have Jesus as our Redeemer. That we do not have to save ourselves. We don't have to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps trying to fight out ourselves. Jesus comes in and he is the conqueror for us. And in Christ, we are more than conquerors. He is the Redeemer, number one. Number two, Jesus is our King. There's parallel here between Melchizedek, who is the King of Peace, right, the city of Salem, and Jesus, who is presented as the Prince of Peace. He comes to rule the church. And as he rules the church, he is leading us to the new Jerusalem, to the new Salem, to the city of peace, where there is reconciliation between us and a holy God, where we are at peace with one another, where there's shalom, where things go back to how they were intended to be back in the Garden of Eden. And as Jesus rules, his throne is founded upon righteousness and justice. We are blessed to have Jesus as our King. But the third part here is the blessing of having Jesus as our high priest. All of Hebrews 5, 6, and 7, all of Hebrews 5 through 7 is laying out the story of Melchizedek, about Aaron, about the Levites, to then point us to Jesus, who is the great high priest. All the other priests lived their life and they died, and their ministry ended. That's one of the things that made the first covenant imperfect, to use the language of Hebrews. But Jesus, being the great high priest, lives forever, and his ministry of the priesthood never ends. This is because he lived, he died, and was resurrected to never die again. Jesus' ministry will go on forever, which is why he's quoted in Psalm 118, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And Jesus is the high priest who not only has an eternal ministry, but he offers sacrifice by himself. This is the way in which we are redeemed. He appeals to his own blood when we have succumbed to sin. And he lives right now to intercede for us. That's what he's doing. In Hebrews 7:22, it says this: "This makes Jesus," after saying the Lord has sworn he will not change his mind, "You are a priest forever." He's talking about Melchizedek, and past that he's talking about Jesus. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. For the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds this priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like other priests, to offer sacrifices daily, for first his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. Jesus comes as this high priest after the order of Melchizedek, and is even more superior yet, because Jesus is the Son priest, the Son of God who comes to fill these offices. And as we see this story, what we see is we see Jesus being presented as our Redeemer, as our King, as our priest. And just as Melchizedek comes out with bread and wine to refresh the soldiers after a long, hard-fought battle, Jesus comes and he brings the same elements to a meal that we as his people share together. We break the bread, we drink the wine together as God's covenant people, both as the reality that Christ has defeated sin and death. This meal points backward to the work on the cross, but it also points forward to the celebration that we will have at the marriage supper of the Lamb. That we will get to feast with God because of what he has done for us. And when we see what God has done for us through his Son Christ, we see that Jesus is worthy of all praise and glory and honor. Jesus is worship of all of our worship. He's worthy of our allegiance. He's worthy of our obedience. He's worthy of our tithes. If in the first covenant, the tithe was 10%, and that covenant was inferior to the new covenant, how much more generous should we be towards God and his work here? This is the outworking of those, like a natural response of those who are truly responding to the grace of God. We've been blessed to be a blessing. Let us walk as citizens of the kingdom of our beloved Son, God's beloved Son. Let us walk without fear, because we have a great high priest who is interceding for us right now. Let us not fear, because we have a God who is King of the cosmos, that is working all things together for the good of those who love him. And let us not fear, because we have a great Redeemer who can save to the uttermost. Let's pray.